Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode number 72. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, Joe from Jersey. Joe, who is on the warpath right now, getting ready for the New York Open, getting ready for Masters Worlds. Feeling pretty fucking fired up. What else can I say? Training is a lot of fun for me right now. Feel really focused. Feel really driven. Don't feel too bad physically either, considering how hard I'm training, which is quite remarkable. But anyway, that's how I'm doing. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for listening as always. Thank you for tuning in. Kind of going to try something different this week. This is going to be sort of a mailbag episode. I posted a question on social media asking folks, what should I talk about on today's episode? And it's really remarkable how little preparation I do for these podcasts. This is something that popped into my brain this morning. And here we are. That was 5:30 in the morning. So here we are later in the day. It's now 3:07 p.m. Going for it. I haven't really given any thought to either of the conversations or either of the questions that I've chosen to discuss on today's episode. But before I begin, I would just like to encourage you, if you do have a question that you think might be beneficial for the audience to hear my take on, email me, bjjmeditations@gmail.com. Send it over. And I'd be happy to answer it on the show. You know, maybe give you useful information, maybe make an ass out of myself in the process, maybe both. I don't know what you get out of this podcast. Some of you guys keep coming back week after week. Clearly, I'm doing something you like. Either you find it amusing or useful. I have no idea. Guys, it's lonely. It's lonely being the host of this podcast. It's mostly me talking to my iPhone and this microphone. I don't ever hear from you. I'd love to know how you're doing. Drop me a note. Say hi. Introduce yourself. Love to meet you. It's a lonely business. Anyway, here we go. The old college try. First question comes from a guy I've been corresponding with a lot lately, Mr. Randall Davis of Kung Fu Conversations, which if you haven't checked out Kung Fu Conversations, you should check it out. Even if you don't do Kung Fu. Some thought-provoking stuff. I often say that we forget about the art in martial artistry, and those guys bring the art. So check them out. Anyway, Randall asks, does BJJ mean the same thing today as the first day you stepped on the mat? How has it or how has it changed? Sorry, how has it or has it changed? I don't know. Okay, so to answer your first question, does it mean the same thing today as when you first stepped on the mat? No, it doesn't. It means something completely different. And I'll say that when I first stepped on the mat in jiu-jitsu, I'm not even sure I understood what it meant. I was in this position in my life where things were going really well in some ways and not so well in other ways. Really well, I had just gotten engaged to my wife. We were a few months away from being married. My wife is an amazing partner. She's the love of my life. I grow more attracted to her every year that goes by. And I think our relationship grows even deeper every year that goes by, particularly with a child in the mix. So I don't think I could have blundered my way into a better relationship than I did with my wife. So that's all great. What was not so great at the time was my career was kind of about to bottom out. You know, I was a newspaper editor at the Star Ledger, which is the biggest newspaper in the state of New Jersey. I don't know if it is anymore. It was. And the Ledger was going through this digital transformation where they woke up and discovered the internet in the year 2009 and realized that they needed to do something about that. So they became a digital media company with print sort of being secondary to that. And I ended up being on the side of the print business just because that was where the majority of my experience was. I had joined the ranks as a copy editing intern and risen up through the ranks to the managerial level, mostly like putting out the newspaper every single night. Was one of those guys and women who would work the overnight hours when crazy shit happens, trying to get the product out the door. It was fun. I learned a lot. Learned a lot about keeping a cool head under fire. Learned a lot about leadership, particularly where I had leaps and bounds left to grow as a leader. And I learned a lot about people. What I did not learn a lot about was digital media. And it was obvious to me that digital was where things were going. And I kind of longed to be on the digital side of the business after we had gotten this new print operation up and running. That was sort of my job as part of this team, and we were going to figure out how to make newspapers in an environment where we were a truly digital first media organization. So we basically had to upend everything we did previously about making a product, figure it out how to do it all over again, figured out how to do it with limited resources. And it was a wonderful challenge, but eventually, like, we figured this out, we got the operation up and running, and I came to this painful realization of, like, now what? What do I do? And this feeling of aporia, of uncertainty, of unknowing, permeated everything with the exception of my relationship. I really didn't, I was starting to have like a mini existential crisis when one of my coworkers asked me if I wanted to try jujitsu. And this guy, whose name was also Joe, was a supremely cool dude, had fantastic taste in music. He had a mohawk, and he had a framed portrait of Amiri Baraka on his desk, which I believe he took himself. So obviously, whatever Joe had to offer, I was going to listen to. And he offered to accompany me to a trial jiu-jitsu class at his school, which was in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, was a school called Performance Jiu-Jitsu. And that's where I got my first taste of the art. And I joined on the spot that night. And I didn't know what I was joining for. I just knew that there was more to my life than chasing this blind alley of a career goal. Like, up until then, I had sort of defined myself in terms of who I was within a relationship and who I was within a given profession. Like, those were my two defining characteristics. And I was gradually waking up to this possibility that there was more to life than this, which sounds super naive and simplistic to say right now. But it's one of those things where there's a very big difference between realized, actualized knowledge versus hypothetical, propositional knowledge. And that's the distinction we're talking about here. Like, I knew this fact intellectually, but I did not know it to be true experientially. And jiu-jitsu woke me up to that experiential truth. It brought me back into my body, and it made me realize in a profound way that there was far more to life than what I had constructed in my mental model of this thing called life. So I don't know what to say in terms of what attracted it to me then and there, other than that something innate inside of me recognized it as a vehicle for this awakening that I'm describing. So that's what I experienced in that moment when I first started. It was really this bright, brand new, shiny thing that the more I interacted with it, the more I fell in love with it, and the more I realized there was to discover. It really is like love in the true sense. Like, I feel the same way. Obviously, like, I love my I love my wife much more than I love jiu-jitsu. Like, those things don't even compare. And I love my son much more than I love jiu-jitsu. But that process of love unfolding, it's very similar to what I feel with them as what I feel to jiu-jitsu. It's an unfolding. It's a falling into this well, and you think like you've gone as far as deep as the well goes, but like it just keeps getting deeper. So, and how has my relationship changed to jiu-jitsu? There's less codependency than there used to be. Like, this similar pattern I just described, where like my identity was wrapped up in this thing called work and this thing called relationship. COVID brought me out of the martial arts for like 6 months, I think. And I proved to myself that I could survive without this thing. I certainly missed its presence, and I certainly felt a void in my life. But, here I am still alive, having not trained 6 months of jiu-jitsu. But what I've come to realize now, and this is largely through my work with Emily and with Josh, is that jiu-jitsu, to borrow an analogy from my dear friend Diego of Power Trip Worldwide, jiu-jitsu is kind of like the hub of the wheel, right? Like, if the wheel is how my life is organized, jiu-jitsu is the hub of that wheel. And jiu-jitsu is an embodied practice I can use to train all of these thematic principles that constitute the outer rim of that wheel. I can train jujitsu to become a more dominant grappler. I can train jujitsu to be more present and aware of the circumstances in my life and the circumstances in the internal world. So that's the big departure from then to now. It's almost jujitsu to me. Yes, it's a martial art, but almost secondary to that is that now it's a way of life. Hope that answers your question, Randall. Thank you always for listening, and thank you always for sending me interesting shit, man. You're a solid dude, and you're just another person I'm profoundly grateful to have gotten to know from doing this podcast. So, question 2 selected for this podcast comes from a student. I'm not going to name their name just because we didn't clear that ahead of time, and I want to respect their privacy. But the student said, by far the biggest discouragement I face in BJJ is the feeling of the sport not being worth it on the virtue that I'm not as talented as others, both mentally and physically. I understand the argument that we shouldn't compare ourselves to others, but firstly, everyone does it subconsciously, and secondly, it almost feels like I'm wasting my time putting so much energy into an endeavor that will give me few relative results. I essentially have to sacrifice time I can be using elsewhere just to try to keep pace, and I feel jealous others can maintain a BJJ life balance while still learning more quickly. Why should I have to work twice as hard for the same result? How can I motivate myself to continue when I know the future isn't too bright for my potential? I know you've trained with a lot of natural-born competitors and athletes, and even PBJJ has some people I feel improve so much more quickly compared to well below average Joe. So I was thinking you might have insights on this. Well, maybe I do. I already sent some of them to you through DMs just because I felt some distress in your message, and I don't know if that's my projection or if that's valid. But essentially what I said to this person was that think about artists in the classical sense, literal painters, think about musicians that you love, think about writers that you love. The 3 examples that I gave: musician, Bob Dylan; artist, Van Gogh; writer, Charles Bukowski. So let's look at Bob Dylan first. Bob Dylan, he's an enigmatic human being, and he's an artist in the classical sense. But if you look at his technical proficiency as, let's say, a guitarist, a pianist, and a vocalist, he's like an okay guitarist at best. He's a pretty shitty piano player, and I think arguably if you're going to evaluate him as like a classical vocalist, he's one of the worst, and his voice has only continued to deteriorate as he ages. Both combination of cigarette smoke and nasally singing voice, which I can relate to. Very hard on your vocal cords. Anywho, Bob Dylan is a master of songwriting, and he's a master of songwriting for perhaps enigmatic reasons, but to me, he's a master of songwriting because he's porous to the world around him, and he's able to take these things in and metabolize them through his own sense of self and produce something beautiful. So to like evaluate Bob Dylan along similar criteria that you've described, are there better guitar players? Are there better vocalists? Are there better songwriters? Yeah, there might even be better songwriters than Bob Dylan, but there's only one Bob Dylan. And he does what he does because he loves it. He does it for its own sake. I imagine you could make the same case for somebody like Van Gogh. Van Gogh got into painting later in life. If you asked him to do something realistic, he probably couldn't do it. I mean, there's certainly like a brutality to Van Gogh's work. I forget which painting it is. I saw it when I was in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. One of his early paintings, he was painting these sand dunes, and he was out on the beach and the wind was blowing sand. And at one point he just kind of like took this trowel thing that you use to like put paint on your palette, and he just kind of smeared paint across the canvas, and you can actually see the sand in the paint. So there's this crude sort of brutality to his artistry, and obviously there's like a high level of abstraction there to where some of it looks like almost childlike, but that is what gives it its innate quality of beauty, right? That's what gives it its timelessness. It speaks to something enduring in the human consciousness and in the human soul. So again, we have somebody who like we can evaluate in terms of technical proficiency, the ability to master something quickly, and it all falls apart because we're missing the point. You know, he was metabolizing the world around him and producing something undeniably beautiful as a result through him. It was almost as if this thing was being born through him. And then a writer like Charles Bukowski, and I'm using Bukowski as an example, not because he's one of my favorite writers. I mean, I think he's great. I enjoy him, but he's not somebody I'd sort of put on my Mount Rushmore of writers. But like if you read stuff like Barfly, extremely brutal, crude. You know, this was kind of a bastard of a human being and of a guy, and the veil of fiction in his work is very thin. Like this is really him writing about himself in a lot of ways. But again, it's compelling. It's real. It pulls at you. It speaks to you because of its realness, because of its brutality. And once again, this is somebody just plumbing the depths of their own life and their own human experience and producing something that is undeniably attractive and compelling. Now, once again, we can evaluate the work of Charles Bukowski along the lines of traditional literary criticism, and he falls apart, but that's not the point. You can make the same argument about Kerouac. Like, Kerouac broke all the rules. When I read Kerouac, it's like I'm hearing some hopped up kid from New Jersey speaking to me. I know he's not from New Jersey, but that's kind of the rhythm of his prose. That's how it comes across, this staccato New Jersey kind of feeling. But it all falls apart under traditional literary scrutiny. So what I'm trying to say here is that the martial arts, in my opinion, are no different. You know, just as you could look at writing, you could look at painting, you could look at music as ways of transmitting information. A martial art is a way of transmitting information. It's just as practical. It's even more practical because it's a transmission of information that has real utility in terms of saving your ass in a shitty situation. But it's no different in the sense that it is an expression of who you are when it is done at its highest levels. You are taking information that's around you and metabolizing it and producing something that is unique to you and your experiences by way of years of training and by way of years of experience. So I think that, yeah, you can get super critical and subjective and objective rather, and say, you know, what are the markers of success here? How many world championships have I won? Who's better than me in the hierarchy of my school? And I certainly see that. It's never really been something that has spoken to me in that way. And I feel like I'm a little bit naive and myopic in that sense. Like I have looked at jiu-jitsu the same way like I look at playing guitar. I'm not the most technically proficient guitar player. I'm not even a good guitar player. I'm not the most technically proficient grappler. I don't even think I'm a good grappler. Good enough to be a black belt, but am I good enough to be a world champion? We'll see. That's part of the experiment of this whole endeavor, right? But I'm able to use this martial art to express something about the world and about me when I'm doing it at its highest level. And for the person who asked this question, I hope that you can one day experience that for yourself, because to me, that's what this is all about. It's about having that meaningful experience and creating that meaningful experience for yourself. And once that becomes the process, and then once that becomes sort of the hub of the wheel, all the other stuff is kind of just like nice to have, but not essential. So that's what I got for you folks this week. I hope that was a useful deployment of your 20 minutes here. Thank you very much for listening. As always, please feel free to write me at any time. BJJ Meditations at gmail.com is the best way to reach me. And yeah, we will talk soon. Take care.